Y'all, welcome to Wake Up America Ministries this morning. The camera person back there is making me laugh. So forgive me for that. I'm going to have to talk to her after this. But anyway, last week we started a message series saying, how far will you go? And so while we're waiting for people to get signed on or whatever, I'm just going to give us a quick recap of last week, just the highlights basically. So you remember there was this man called Saul who God renamed to be Paul because he had this miraculous experience in the Lord on the road to Damascus, where his purpose was on that day to go and persecute Christ's church. And anyway, that never came to pass. Well, from that point on, because Paul realized, hey, Christ is real, and I need him, and so he made it a purpose within his heart to serve him, and he began to go, and he was preaching and teaching the word. So at this point, he was in Asia Minor, which is that area kind of just north of the Mediterranean Sea. And remember, the Feast of Weeks, or the Feast of Pentecost, was coming about, and Paul purposed in his heart to go to Jerusalem to partake of that feast, to participate in that feast. And so while he was preaching and teaching in the places where he was at, these certain people took offense to the things that he was preaching. Basically, they said he was like a false prophet. He was teaching a false doctrine, and that he had defiled the temple. And so anyway, they purposed in the heart, they grabbed him by force, they were dragging him out of the city, they were beating on him, and these Roman soldiers basically came in and saved the day, but they thought Paul was a person that had committed sedition, and so they immediately bound him and then tried to sort out the facts kind of after the fact. And so Paul was allowed to speak to the crowd. He did. And then afterwards, they demanded in a kind of a tumultuous manner that Paul should be killed. And so this is where we pick it up this week in Acts 22. And it's 24 through 30. We're not going to read all of that, of course. But I'm just going to read verses 24 and verse 25. And so the chief captain of the guard, hey Abby, this is what he said. He said the chief captain commanded him, talking about Paul, to be brought into the castle and bade that he should be examined by scourging, that he might know wherefore. Well, let me see. Let me get it. I'm struggling this morning, as y'all can see. The chief captain commanded him to be brought into the castle and bade that he should be examined by scourging, that he might know wherefore they cried so against him, or basically why they were asking for him to be killed. It said, and as they bound him with thongs, Paul said unto the centurion that stood by, is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned? So what's happening here is they were going to basically beat a confession out of Paul. Now, if you remember, if you ever saw that movie, The Passion of the Christ, you saw that when they beat him, they had this table, and on this table were just various tools that they used to basically examine people, or as they word it, but basically to punish or torture or beat a confession out of them. So whether it was going to be like a regular whip, or whether it was going to be a cat of nine tails that had pieces of metal and bone and things attached to the ends of it, don't exactly know what the chief captain had in mind, but this is what he said. But then Paul was a Roman. He was a Jew, but he was also a Roman citizen, And so, anyhow, Paul knew what his rights were as a citizen, and he let them know, hey, I'm a citizen, and it's unlawful for you to do these things to me. And so then they backed off of that and held him basically in jail overnight. And then we go to, it says the next day, Paul, he goes before the Sanhedrin. Now, who was the Sanhedrin? The Sanhedrin was a council. It was a Jewish religious council of 70 men made up of Pharisees and Sadducees. So, well, what's the difference between the two? Well, it's a little bit like our Democrats and our Republicans. They both parties believed in God, but the the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection, in angels or spirits. So now Paul is before this council on the next day, and Ananias, who's the acting high priest, and I don't have time to go in and explain why he's the acting high priest. He was not the official high priest. He was just kind of a temporary fill-in, and we'll leave it at that. But anyway, so he begins to question Paul, and Paul kind of speaks a prophetic word to him. He says, you are a whitewashed wall. In other words, means, you can have some rotten wood, and you can slap some brand new paint on there, and you can hide up a lot of rottenness. And so basically that's what Paul's accusation to him was. So anyway, so then they slapped Paul in the face and said, dare you talk to the high priest like that? Well, Paul said, well, I didn't even know he was the high priest. But anyway, so then they began to question him, and Paul perceived something, and this is, of course, under the anointing of the Holy Spirit, that maybe the whole council wasn't there, but anyway, there were Pharisees and there were Sadducees there, because remember, Paul was highly educated under Gamaliel in Jewish religious matters. He was highly educated in that, and so he knew the difference between the two, and so he used this to his advantage. And so what he does is he begins to declare the fact. He said, hey, I was once a Pharisee, or I actually am a Pharisee. And so he gained sympathy from the members of the council, from the Pharisees, to kind of take Paul's side here, or at least to some degree. And so then another kind of righteous kind of situation kind of arises, because there was a dispute between the Pharisees on the council and the Sadducees. And so it got to a point where Roman soldiers, again, had to come in and had to intervene. Now, this time they did intervene on Paul's behalf, because Paul was now known to be a Roman, see, I didn't say it that time, a Roman citizen. So, anyway, so they did. And so, anyhow, now this is how God works. So Paul's being held for his own safety now, kind of at this point. Plus, there had been accusations made, and those things had to be heard. And so Paul had a nephew, and I'm sure you've heard this story preached before. Paul's nephew, he overheard 40 plus men plotting to kill Paul, and actually made a vow amongst themselves that they were not going to eat until Paul had been killed. So anyway, so this plot's being worked out, and Paul's nephew overhears this thing, and he goes and he tells Paul. And so Paul relayed that to the centurion, or the guard that was watching him, and he goes and he tells the chief captain. Well, because Paul is a Roman citizen, he had special rights at this point. So anyway, but if you read this passage, the ironic thing is these men that were plotting this to kill Paul, basically murder him in cold blood, they actually go and tell this or reveal this plot to Ananias, the high priest, and they become co-conspirators in this plot. So that's how threatened they were, and it really wasn't threatened by God or by Paul, but they were threatened by this, basically their own livelihood. And we don't really have time to get into that too much. But anyway, because if they accepted Christ, then there was no longer a need for a high priest over the temple. So anyway, that's all we're going to say about that. So anyway, so Paul has now favor with the chief captain. So what he did was he appointed 472 soldiers. So that's a lot of protection for one man. Well, hey, that's how God works, right? So anyway, 472 soldiers going to take Paul in the night to a place called Antipatris. And so they get there sometime late that night or in the wee morning hours, whatever the case was. And anyway, so there were foot soldiers, there were horsemen, there were javelin throwers. Anyway, it was a lot of soldiers, plus the chief captain and so on. But so then some of them leave and return back to Jerusalem, but he still leaves 70 horsemen with Paul. And get this, Paul didn't have to walk. They gave Paul a horse, but Paul wasn't alone in this. Because remember, Paul had his little entourage. We know that there was Luke, because Luke wrote this account, and there was another a gentleman with him, and I thought I wrote his name down here. And anyway, maybe I didn't, but maybe I wrote it on the next page. But anyhow, so the goal here was to get Paul to Caesarea. So then the next day, they go on to Caesarea. Now remember, Caesarea was the home of Philip the Evangelist, and it was somewhere 50 or 60 miles or so from Jerusalem. So in about a 2-day journey, unless you really rode your horse really hard. But anyhow, so 5 days go by now. So 5 days, they meet in Caesarea, 5 days go by, and Paul, again, he's being held in what they call Herod's Judgment Hall. And this is in chapter 24. And again, Ananias and the elders come, and they bring with them a man called Tertullus. Now, we're going to hit on something here, and I want you to pay attention to this, because see if you don't see some sort of a similarity, yeah, that's the word that I'm looking for, between what was happening to Paul in his day and what is happening right here now in our own country. So let me read this. So Jake's leaving, that's what you hear. So anyway, here we are, chapter 24, and it says, after 5 days, Ananias the high priest descended with the elders and with a certain orator named Tertullus, who informed the governor against Paul. So what they did, they brought this great orator, this great speaker in to come before Felix. And so whether he's a lawyer or what exactly he was, we don't exactly know. But apparently he was a much better speaker, and he had the gift of gab, the power, to convince people that the things that he said were legit. But anyway, verse 2 said, and when he was called forth, Tertullus began to accuse him, talking about Paul, saying, seeing that by thee we enjoy great quietness, and that very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by their providence. Now, what he's doing here is he's buttering up Felix. He's trying to gain favor by speaking words that are going to appeal to his vanity. But this is what he's going to say in verse 5 and 6 about Paul. It says, for we have found this man a pestilent fellow, and a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world. Now, not just Jerusalem, where all of this took place, but all the Jews throughout the world. Now, when he referred to the world here, he was mainly referring to the Roman Empire, which basically at that time, they controlled pretty much everything from just east of Israel all the way west, basically even into many parts of Europe. So they had a lot of land. So that's what they referred to as the world. So anyway, so here we have this. Well, let me go on. It says, and a mover of sedition. Now, I said that word again because I want you to, have you heard that word recently before? A mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, who also hath gone about to profane the temple, whom we took and would have judged according to our law. And then he goes into how the soldiers intervened and took him into custody, and basically they had to come and they had to see Felix. So I want you to think about this. Now, in these times, if you are proven to be a seditionist, or basically somebody that's going to cause trouble or try to overthrow the government, that was a death penalty offense. Now, when Paul, if you remember, when Paul was first taken into custody, the chief captain thought Paul was a man who had raised up a move against the government, a seditionist. That's who they thought he was, until Paul declared to them, no, I'm not that guy. I am Paul, a citizen of Cilicia, a Roman citizen. So what they were trying to do here is, again, they were trying to get Paul killed. And so Paul then pleads his defense before Felix. Now I'm going to read verse 27 here because it's important. All of this is not happening in rapid succession. You read this and sometimes you kind of have a tendency to think, well, these things are happening like sometimes within the same day or sometimes within the same week, a very short period of time. But I want to point this out here because the title of our message is, How Far Will You Go? And so I'm going to read verse 27. And so it says, but after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room. And Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. So now here we are. You have Felix, who hears what Paul has to say. He don't condemn him. He don't set him free or anything. And so what happens is he keeps him in Herod's judgment hall for 2 more years before Festus, who was a kind of a ruler of a different, because they had kind of, the Roman kingdom was split up into parts, and each part had a governor or a high ruler. And so Festus was one of those who maybe had more authority than what Felix did. But anyway, so now here comes Festus. And so in all of this, Paul is now allowed to speak to both parties. So not only now has he testified to Felix, he's now going to turn around and say basically the same thing back to Festus. So why is that important? Because the gospel is being preached to people in high places. That's why that's important. But anyway, but keep in mind, 2 years go by. Paul is accused of sedition. And I'm just going to throw this out there. Is the devil not doing the same thing right here in America today? The January 6th, 2021 incident. What have you been hearing? White Christian nationalists. They were responsible for what happened at the Capitol. White Christian nationalists. What was Paul being called? A white Christian nationalist. He's going to overthrow the government. He's going to create trouble. You need to deal with him. And that's exactly what we're seeing play out right here in America today. They keep beating that drum and beating that drum. Just food for thought. Anyhow, so Paul now, he's testified before Festus, but then Paul does something because he's now being held in captivity some 2 years now. Because remember, all this started back in 57 A.D. And so 2 years has gone by. He's finally getting to hear Festus. So what does Paul do? He says, I demand to be heard by Caesar. Because, see, at this point, neither one of them two cats was wanting to make a decision whether to either do something with Paul, whether to let him go, or whether to punish him. And the truth of the matter is, they didn't know what to do. But then here comes King Agrippa. Now you remember, Paul testifies to King Agrippa, and King Agrippa makes a very profound statement. He said, almost you persuade me to be a Christian. So now, he's had Felix, he's had Festus, and now King Agrippa. So he's making contact with people in high places. So yeah, but he's been in jail for 2 years and he didn't do anything but preach the gospel. That's true. But look at the influence that he's had over people in very high places. But I want to read this to you. This is 26, and like I said, we're not taking the time to explain everything, just kind of hitting the high points here. And this is really important because if you know your Bible, then you know next week where we're heading with all of this. But anyway, this is what happens, or this is what is said in chapter 26. And it said, and when they were gone aside, they talked between themselves, saying, this man doeth nothing worthy of death or of bonds. Then said Agrippa unto Festus, this man might have been set at liberty if he had not appealed unto Caesar. And there was something here I was supposed to read, and I guess went by it. And let me find that real quick because this is a very important part. And anyway, if I can't find it real quick, I'm just going to tell you what it is. Oh yeah, back in chapter 23. So before the plot was revealed, remember we was talking about Paul's nephew? I meant to read this, but this is important. It said, and the night following the Lord stood by him and said, be of good cheer, Paul, for as thou hast testified to me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome. So now Paul has this confirmation by the Lord. And actually there had been more than one confirmation, but here the Lord is speaking to him. He said, don't worry about how long you're going to be in jail. Don't worry about what's going to be said. Don't worry about what might be done. He said, you will. You will make it to Rome. You will speak to those people in Rome on my behalf. But again, how far will you go? Is it worth in your mind if you were in a similar situation? If God said, this is my purpose, this is my calling, this is your assignment, but before you can fulfill your assignment, you're going to spend some time in jail. You might be beaten, you might be mobbed, you might be threatened, you might be plotted against. Is it worth what you're going to have to go through before you fulfill, and I really don't like using the word destiny or fate, but basically to fulfill the calling that God's placed upon you? And the answer to that is this. Of course it is. So, well, I don't want to go to jail. I don't want to be beaten. I don't want to be threatened. I don't want the IRS to come and investigate me because they think, I'm a spooky kind of person. Hey, look here. Nobody ever said it'd be easy. And for Paul, it hadn't been easy. Now, fortunately, they did have, because Paul was a Roman citizen, they did treat him fairly well. He was still under guard 24/7. And for 2 years, he's had a guard attached to his hip all night and all day. Now, he did have some certain freedoms. They allowed people to come and visit him, and they actually gave him a fairly decent place to stay. He wasn't in the darkest prison, but he was not free to just go where he wanted. But anyway, how far will you go? Think about that. How far will I go for the Lord? He went all the way for us. Will we not go all the way for him? We should. We should want to. Next week, we'll finish this, and I hope that you're being challenged by this provoking thought for you. Keep praying for these victims of the hurricane, both in, Puerto Rico. Some of the things I read is really bad down there. Florida got hit pretty hard. I hadn't really heard anything about South Carolina, that area. But anyway, keep praying for these folks. Open your hearts to them. And we actually had an opportunity to talk to a lady in Walmart Friday who was from, what's that? I can't remember. It was something Cove. Anyway, right there at the area of impact when it first made landfall as a Category 4 in Florida. But anyway, they were this far north to escape all of that. But anyhow, keep praying for them. Keep praying the Lord touch you and work in your life and your loved ones. Hey, if you don't have a home church, we invite you to the Rock Worship Center. And if you don't want to come to the Rock Worship Center, hey, go somewhere. Go somewhere. All right, well, that's all we have for you this week. Remember, Jesus is coming soon. Be ready to meet him when he calls you. All righty. Lord willing, we'll see you next week.